The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your hosts, James Floyd. I write for StarWars.com and Star Wars Insider magazine.
I'm Melissa Miller. I am the science writer at Nerdist, and I also write for Star Wars Insider magazine. This episode is a recording of our panel with Cosplay for Science at Los Angeles Comic-Con called The Living Force, Evolution in the Star Wars Galaxy. Unfortunately, James, my co-host, couldn't make it to the panel, but we had a great time, and I hope you enjoy this recording of the panel where we talk about evolution of planets, of species, and how everything ties together in the Star Wars universe. Thanks so much for all of you who came out. Enjoy!
This panel is brought to you by the Cosplay for Science initiative. We are a group of scientists and nerds and cosplayers who love to combine all of those things to share all the amazing science that inspired the worlds that we love. And today we're going to talk about probably my favorite, the best one, I will say. You can fight me later, I have a lightsaber. And we're not just going to talk about just, general science in Star Wars. We're going to talk about something really special to me. We're going to talk about how life on Earth inspired life in a galaxy far, far away. As a paleontologist myself, and we'll learn more about who we all are in a second, I like to say that anything in life, in our actual planet, is stranger than anything you can come up with in fiction. And we're going to show you that today by looking at a few examples. And we've got some amazing scientists and educators and experts on our panel today to help share those cool things. So why don't we go ahead and get started and say who you all are. Let's see. Say who you are, what you do, and maybe what your favorite Star Wars planet is, or animal.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela. I'm a PhD student at UC Riverside. I work on planetary atmospheres, and I'm particularly interested in thinking about how life interacts with both the planet's surface and its atmosphere. I would say my favorite Star Wars planet is probably Tatooine.
Gosh darn it. Hi, my name is Phil Bowen. I'm also a PhD researcher at the University of California, Riverside. My research focuses on early animal paleontology, so I dig up fossils in South Australia. And I also work on impact crater distribution on Mars, so widespread. And my favorite planet is also Tatooine, so I should have gone first.
Hi, I'm Melissa Miller. I am a science writer at Nerdist, and I also co-host a podcast called Star Warsologies, where we talk about this just all the time. Talk about different experts about how their field overlaps with Star Wars. And I made some Star Wars documentaries, wildlife documentaries, because I'm an ecologist by schooling and love all of the animals, especially porgs. And you can check those out if anyone was at Celebration, and they're on YouTube too, little nature documentaries.
Hi, my name is Rick O'Connor. I'm the manager of educational programs at the Columbia Memorial Space Center in Downey. I am working on my master's in science education at Cal State Long Beach with an emphasis on learning experiences in informal settings, so any learning experience that happens outside of the formal classroom. I also pull occasional shifts up at Griffith Observatory, so I'm a total space nerd and Star Wars nerd, so that's why I'm up here.
Does this count as an informal learning? We're all learning.
Yes,
right
we
now,
are all learning. It's not in a formal classroom.
Well, welcome everybody. I should introduce myself too. My name is Gabe Santos. I am the Director of Education at the Raymond M. Alf Museum of Paleontology. I used to study marine mammal evolution, but I've since switched to researching how people like to learn, especially in non-academic settings like Comic-Cons. I'm also a Grosvenor Teacher Fellow with National Geographic and Lindblad Expeditions, so I really, really like to get to talk about paleontology and things like that with lots of people. Really quick, this panel is also sponsored by Star Warsologies. I really recommend all of you to check it out. It's an amazing podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. And the Raymond M. Alf Museum of Paleontology, which is the museum that I'm from. We're located in Claremont. We're about a 40-minute drive from Los Angeles, and we've got a lot of really cool fossils from all over the world on display there.
Wait, Rick, did you say your favorite planet or animal?
Oh, I didn't. I would say my favorite animal are probably the Purgles. I have a fondness for the animated series. Yeah.
I would say my favorite is probably the Nunas. They're like these weird chicken-like things. They're in that book that Charles Whitlash made. I like them because they look so derpy, and I like derpy animals in general.
That's a Naboo thing, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Naboo, yeah, but they're like one of those invasive species throughout the galaxy.
Okay.
So anyway. So, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about 5 distinct planets and environments today, and kind of share what, kind of cool evolution and lifestyle and life that has evolved on these different planets. And actually, for you two, we're going to start off on Tatooine.
Let's go.
Yeah. So Tatooine is a very, very popular planet in the Outer Rim in the Star Wars galaxy. It's unique. It's got 2 suns. It's a breathable atmosphere, but it's a very hot and arid planet. It's the stereotypical desert planet in science fiction. It's got only 1% water. That's not really great for hospitable life. But as we've seen in the Expand universe and the recent book of Boba Fett, there is evidence of ancient oceans, both in the culture and in the geology of Tatooine. And there's some really uniquely adapted organisms on Tatooine. So, for our expert panelists, what do you think about Tatooine? Is it cool, plausible? What about the animals there? What do y'all think?
Well, I'm sure Michaela can start off by talking about binary star systems.
Sure, yeah. So I've done a little bit of work on looking at binary star systems, and there aren't any planets like Tatooine that we've discovered thus far. We have found some planets orbit large, big gas giant Jupiter-type planets orbiting 2 sets of stars. There's no reason why we wouldn't see a Tatooine-like planet out there. We just haven't found it yet because with the 2 stars, it can be a little bit harder to detect planets and all of that. I do think from sort of a global climate perspective, that it's definitely a plausible climate. My understanding of the history of Tatooine is that like we're talking about this past global ocean, likely life arose under more hospitable conditions and then sort of evolved as the planet changed. I think there was a catastrophe in Tatooine's past that kind of led to its current climate. So I think in terms of the global climatology and the orbit and all of that, it seems reasonably plausible to me.
I'm curious about how similar it is to Mars, maybe, Phil, because it's clearly that there were oceans there, right? You can't get pod racing canyons without there being water to carve those out. So it's similar to Mars, but then turned into a desert?
Yeah, definitely. There's sedimentary features on there that are clearly, so the sedimentary rocks, right, the cliffs, the canyons, that stuff is clearly being carved out by water. So, and we do see features like that on Mars, where we see deltaic systems, so the deltas and canyons and ancient rivers. Probably the main difference, I'd say, is likely the atmosphere, right? Mars's atmosphere is really thin, right? And Tatooine's clearly because it's breathable. There you go, that's that word. So it has to be a lot thicker, and that's getting the atmosphere studies, which I don't really work on.
No. I was going to say, as an atmospheres person, I think the ability for the planet to retain its atmosphere is largely dependent on how far away it is from the stars. And the whole thing about having 2 suns instead of just 1, if you're far enough away from both of those stars and you're kind of in a stable orbit around both of them, it ends up not actually really mattering that much in terms of the change in level of light and things like that the planet receives. So I actually think, just going off of the size of the stars in Tatooine's sky, which is not a very scientific method, but just going off of that, I would guess that Tatooine is probably far enough away in this sort of stable orbit where it goes around both stars that it could retain a thicker atmosphere. I think Tatooine is also closer to Earth's size, whereas Mars is quite small, and that's why it has such a thin atmosphere, among other reasons.
Cool.
I think one of the cool things about Tatooine is you can actually go. They filmed a lot of the scenes in Death Valley. It's about a 4-hour drive-ish from here.
Yeah.
And really, when you kind of do the backcountry camping out in Death Valley, it really feels like you're kind of in the middle of nowhere, kind of how it was on Tatooine. So I think that's why I like Tatooine, because we can go and visit. It's not that far.
I have seen Jawas in Death Valley. And actually, my co-host James Floyd he runs a travel company called Galaxy Far, Far Away. And they, do tours and stuff like that, and usually dress up as Jawas and run around the
You can walk through that canyon that R2 was kind of driving through, and and the Jawas peeking out. You can actually walk right through that canyon and see those spaces where the Jawas were poking their heads out.
Right. Yeah.
Wait, James runs a travel company that brings you out there for that? I'm really just finding about this.
Yeah. And in Simi Valley, the other Jedi temple that Mando and Grogu go to is in Simi Valley, and so he also does hikes up there in Southern California. And then they're scouting out places in Tunisia and Jordan and stuff like that. So you should check that out. Oh, yeah.
I mean, you know what's the cool thing too that I think about if you can go out there, right? Like for me as a paleontologist geologist, you can actually look at the rocks that make up Beggar's Canyon, and you can actually look at that to see evidence of past water. You know, like in geology, we look at sedimentary rocks as a way to read the past, and there needs to be water for those sediments mostly to form. And so that's another way we can look at there once being water just by looking at the rocks that they show in the film, right, guys?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the evidence of water is very clear if you're looking at those rocks that you see in the film. And of course, Death Valley was a lake, I'm pretty sure. So when you go out there and you look at those different rock layers, right, you can see sort of changes in seasonality in the different rock layers. So like there's times where there's a lot more organic material, right? So it's like a darker layer, and then there's sort of a lighter layer because, you know, and it all varies about like the changing seasons, right? If it's fall, right, there's all the leaves in the ground, right? And it's compared to like it being like winter or summer. You know, additionally, the fact that there was water there would lead to some interesting paleontological questions about like the abundance of fossils, the type of organisms that used to be there, and then how they've adapted or gone extinct as the planet, devolves into it or desertifies, I guess.
Yeah, you can definitely find ocean fossils out in like Ansbrago and Death Valley and stuff like that, which always blows my mind. So they'd be very similar. And something like the Crate Dragon, you know, if the history of that is that it was once an oceanic creature, I mean, something that big evolving in water makes enough sense, right? Like the biggest creatures on Earth are whales, and so maybe all those legs were flippers or something like that, and then it had to adapt when the water went away and swim through the sand instead. So, you know, that's because most of what you see in our deserts here, if you go out to Joshua Tree or something like that, are smaller animals. So, you know, the fact there's rodents and womp rats and all that kind of stuff all over Tatooine, sure. Those big things, you know, it would be probably left over having adapted, and a lot of stuff probably died out. So there's probably lots of cool, I mean, a paleontologist would have a field day, I think, on Tatooine.
Yeah.
I know I would. That's like the first thing, if ever I could go out, I'd be like, hey, who wants to go back to Tatooine? Like, I do. You know, speaking about the animals, Melissa, like, what do you think about some of the animals they've created for Tatooine? Do they look plausible for living in that kind of environment to you?
Yeah, so animals are my favorite part of Star Wars. They're my favorite part of probably life in general too. But you know, I would always like, it feels Star Warsy to me when they do like between scenes, you know, a quick little animal scurries by or something like that. And yeah, I think so, because they showed, I think in Mandalorian they showed like some little like lizard type things crawling around, little desert, you know, hopping rats and things like that. And certainly the other desert planets, like on Pasana, there's some. All of that stuff makes sense. A lot of the big things would live underground. A lot of things would be nocturnal. All of that makes a lot of sense.
I think that's really a cool thing to show, is that a lot of the creators for, you know, these worlds and these creatures on Star Wars, they look to our planet, like I said. They look to the things we know and we recognize as making sense, and use that and adapted it to a galaxy far, far away, and just tweaked them a little bit to make them seem that much more alien, but still make sense in a world like that. Like the banthas and all that, you know, they're based off of different types of animals, like elephants and things like that live in the desert, but they adapted them to look alien, but still kind of make them believable to us.
Yeah, I had the good fortune of interviewing one of the concept artists on all the like Disney Star Wars movies, Jake Lunt Davis, and he actually says that when he looks for inspiration, he'll just watch like a David Attenborough special. And he's like, literally anything in the deep sea is more alien than anything he's come up with. So, I mean, that's definitely true. And, you know, that sort of stuff trickles in, you know, if you're just watching a nature program and then, oh, that would be perfect for Tatooine.
Oh, that sounds like a great job. Okay, so let's move on from this hot desert planet that I'm sure most of us who are from California are like, no big deal. Let's move on to somewhere where Californians probably wouldn't be able to handle. Let's go to Hoth, the frozen world.
Still a desert, though.
That's true.
That's true, very true. So Hoth, you know, this is a frozen world. It's a breathable, it's a very frigid, completely frozen over. You know, we know about the Tauntauns, the Wampas, a lot of surface water, glaciers, and mountains. For this kind of planet, is this something that we might see in in our galaxy, or have we already seen something like this?
Yeah, so absolutely. There was a time in Earth's history, way back when, okay, we're talking over 500 million years ago. It's called Snowball Earth. And it was a time where we had global glaciation all throughout the planet, right? Now, Snowball Earth is interesting for many regards, right? For one thing, discussing whether or not the glaciers were full, proper glaciers all the way down to the equator, or if it was more of like a slush ball kind of mixing and little bits of ice in the water.
No, slush ball Earth doesn't sound quite
Yeah,
as
slush ball
badass.
Earth. Yeah, it doesn't sound as good. The marketing guys, I think, were pushing Snowball Earth. But additionally, what's interesting about Snowball Earth is the minute it ends, you see the beginning of multicellularity in the fossil record, right? Within a couple million years after the end of Snowball Earth, the end of this massive glaciation, you see a push towards multicellularity in the fossil record, and you start finding like the Ediacara which are soft-bodied multicellular animals moving around and eating in these very bizarre environments. So, yeah. So, yes.
So, we had Snowball Earth, but no wampas at that time.
No wampas, no. Or no record of them, at least.
Oh, sneaky wombos.
Yeah.
What I like about Hoth is that we have that analog right away. I mean, yes, they went to Norway, and again, you can go visit, that spot or whatever. They filmed apparently like 10 feet out the door of the hotel because it was so snowy. But what I like is that, those big things, when I was younger, I was like, nothing that big would live, somewhere that cold. But, we absolutely have that here, in the north, in the Arctic, there's absolutely tauntauns and polar bears. There's caribou. They eat the same things that wampas probably do, which is like lichen. They have to live in caves because, if you notice, the tauntaun is adapted for there, but also dies of exposure, right? Or exhaustion or something like that. So, it also can't handle whatever conditions all the time. So there's got to be caves or something like that. So caribou, polar bears, that's an easy analog for sure.
And then, for something like Hoth, if you were to make a documentary, right, Leslie, because you've done things like that, they've gone to Antarctica and stuff, do you think this is something you would want to do, ever, if you had an opportunity?
Be on the filming team?
Yeah.
Absolutely, I would do it. Antarctica is my last continent. It's the only one I haven't been to. So, yeah, if given any sort of a chance, I would go. But I would want one of those cool jackets that they have. And I would just think about Han Solo leaving and being like, then I guess I'll see you in hell. It's very dramatic. So everyone's cranky in the cold. I don't know that I would want to stay, but yeah, absolutely I would go.
Listen, I'm gonna make you jealous really quick.
Yes.
I am actually going to Antarctica in February.
Amazing.
And I'm also bringing my Han Solo cosplay because I want to be one of the first people to do a cosplay in Antarctica. So.
Yes, good for you. Amazing. Represent us all.
Not to show off or whatever.
It's okay.
So with Hoth, it looks like there's not a lot of civilization on there, right? It's a very frozen world. The rebels are there mostly to hide, and then we've got the wampas and the tauntauns living there. Is there a reason that you think they decided to show some of that? Because we have peoples on Earth who were adapted, their whole lifestyle and culture to living in these frozen worlds. Do you think that's just something that they didn't decide to do, or is there just a more storytelling point to it?
I always just assume, I don't know, the monoclimate of all of Star Wars has annoyed me since I was 4 years old. It's desert planet, that's not how that works. But it is in certain circumstances. So yeah, I think it's, is it Kessel, where half of the planet is mines and half of it is this perfect, gorgeous wilderness or something like that. So sure, you could, they never show both sides of planets. It could be. Or, as you say, there could be people who are adapted to that, or alien species that are adapted to that and create civilizations there. When you have the whole galaxy, I never understand why everyone doesn't live on Naboo, personally. Why do so many people live on Coruscant? It seems terrible. We'll get to that. But, yeah, it's certainly possible. And I always want more of that. But, yeah, for storytelling, they're not going to stop and show us everything.
I think they did cover that in Clone Wars, though. The name is escaping me, but don't they go to kind of a snow planet? There's a civil war happening going on. Yeah.
Okay.
So the Clone Wars actually covered people living in those types of environments.
Oh, okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for checking me back on that.
I also wanted to add about the monoclimate comment. You definitely could get a monoclimate planet like that. It's not something where I would recommend. That wouldn't be my first choice to suspect that there would be life or even a large civilization. But I think about this idea called the habitable zone, which is basically where you can have surface liquid water. And we think that's likely where we'll find life if it's out there outside of our solar system, and planets at the very outer edge of the habitable zone, depending on different conditions with their orbit or their distance to the star, they can actually be almost entirely frozen over and just have kind of a little window of open water. Whether you think that that is like really habitable or not is a different kind of question, but it definitely could exist. You just have to place your planet in your starbit.
Would it be more likely on something smaller like a moon, as long as the moon has an atmosphere on it?
Yeah. Phil was just raising the point of Enceladus, which is one of Saturn's moons, and there's also Europa, which is one of Jupiter's moons. Those are more like ice shells, right? So which I don't think is what's going on Hoth. I think it is supposed to be like a rock with snow on the top. So, in terms of having that completely global, cooler ecosystem, it would definitely reach that state faster if it were a smaller body.
Especially further out from the sun.
Yes, further out. Yeah. I think my thoughts would be that it's more a function of the distance from the star. And then if you're talking about, where the planet or moon has existed for long enough to have complex life, then you're not really worried about like how long it takes to get that kind of global glaciation, because the timescales are not really comfortable.
Well, yeah, and I don't think it was Hoth, but in the first episode of Mandalorian, he's on an ice planet, and like this huge walrus thing breaks through the ice.
Yeah.
So that, I at least like that little insight that if you are on an ice planet, there's there's stuff below the surface too that will also try to eat you.
Yeah, and those subsurface oceans, at least in our solar system, are kind of where we think if there is other life there, it's probably hiding under the ice, either on Europa or Enceladus. So that's a question that a lot of solar system scientists really want to explore as well.
Cool.
I'm glad that you brought up habitable zone, because we're going to move on to our next planet. And like Melissa said, this is probably where I would spend my galactic credits to get property.
Yeah.
Let's move over to Naboo, the Garden World. So Naboo, as we've seen in Star Wars Episode 1 and parts of the Clone Wars, it's this beautiful, beautiful planet. Lots of amazing architecture, multiple civilizations that are living on it. It's a beautiful, breathable atmosphere, temperate conditions throughout the planet. And it's really unique because it's got this system of underwater caves that run through the planet apparently, and it's got a huge amount of biodiversity. And this is what, some folks call a garden world. And then Michaela, explain again the habitable zone, right? Like Earth isn't that, right?
Yeah. So sometimes it's also called the Goldilocks zone. It's this idea that if you're too close to the star, it's too hot, and if you're too far away, it's too cold. And if you're right in this habitable zone, things are just right for surface liquid water, which we think is maybe tied to life. That also depends on like how you think about life, but I am sort of on the astronomy end of things, and so we're like, okay, surface liquid water is related to life. In terms of Naboo, I think what's really interesting is canonically there's actually a very active heat source from the interior of the planet. I believe there's like a plasma core, and that generates some of the interest outside of the groups that kind of naturally developed there in kind of mining the planet and getting access to that resource. There's not really like a good analog for that in like real planet formation that I'm aware of, but it is really interesting to think about like how the interior of the planet might affect the development of species or like even the temperature, right? So maybe Naboo is such a great biodiverse world because it has this heat source from the inside, and so it's keeping it at a really stable climate, whereas maybe if just based on its orbit, maybe those things wouldn't happen.
And then, Melissa, like in terms of like kind of the biodiversity as an ecologist, Naboo is probably one of the most biodiverse planets we've ever seen in the galaxy, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, maybe other than like Dagobah, which is, just the swamp planet or something like that, but which I think that Yoda moved there because now we know that Grogu really likes frogs. So I think he moved to Dagobah because it was like a buffet planet. Anyway, we're not talking about Dagobah, but I need to like tell everybody that. Naboo is also like the first that I can think of like multi-environment, right? We were talking about the monoclimate. Like there's forest, there's grasslands, there's the ocean, there's like the abyssal, ocean, the really, really deep ocean. Maybe that goes through the whole planet. I don't think about that one too much. But so we have all sorts of different things. And it's clearly ancient life too, because those big things down in the abyss have clearly been there for a long time. That's why I definitely like Naboo, is you were talking about just all of the various types of species that can be there.
And then, Phil, you studied really, really old looking animals that come from that lived in the ocean, and on Earth, we hypothesized life first appeared in the oceans.
Yes.
So like looking at Naboo and the crazy amounts of alien life forms that exist in their planet Gore kind of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think about like the things you see?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting from an ecological point of view of, you do see full food webs, right? Like, I mean, right, there's always a bigger fish, you know what I mean? So that's a good sign for this ecosystem, right? Like for example, those critters right there, right? If there wasn't a predator in that environment, those animals would just continue to reproduce, continue to eat as much as possible, and that would make an unstable ecosystem, right? Inevitably causing ecological collapse. So on Naboo, not only are we seeing this sort of garden world, right, but we see proper ecological systems, ecological chains that are helping to stabilize it, which is a really nice touch. And we don't really see, we don't see animal life as much, I'd say, on the other worlds, and if we do, they're like dominating the ecosystems, and that's like, at least from our perspective and in how we do ecological modeling, not a stable ecosystem, right? You do need checks and balances for both predators and preys and vegetation in order to keep things stable. In the early animal ecosystems, which we sometimes call the garden of the Ediacaran, so another garden world, you don't have predation, and you have these really abundant microbial mat surfaces. So it's sort of like this, where it's an ecosystem of abundance, there's diversity, but then once that goes away, sort of you get predation and you get more aggressive organisms.
For Melissa and Rick, like looking at Naboo, this is probably what Earth could be like. It could be what we could have. We got our stuff together. What are like some lessons you think we can share from like using Naboo for like teaching us about conservation, or even how we can like be a better galactic citizen, I would say.
I think that the thing that comes to my mind in education, we always talk about the most meaningful and impactful learning experiences are ones in which you experience something, you do something, it's hands-on. You're not just kind of reading about it in a book. And I think the difference between Naboo and a planet that we'll talk about later is how much green space there actually is on Naboo. And that's one thing that there's been a lot of research in the past couple decades about the negative effects of a lack of green space in cities, and especially on inner cities. And so it's really tough when you're talking with students, especially younger children, it's really tough to get them to buy in on conservation and why we need to protect our environment when they just don't see it around them. If they don't see it at all, there's no local parks for them to visit. They don't have trees on their block, so when they walk down the street, they don't see the types of birds that they change throughout the year, and they learn about migration that way. So when cities don't have those green spaces, there's just no personal buy-in when we talk about trying to fight climate change. And so there's a lot of movement now in cities to conserve those green spaces, build more parks, making sure that we're not clearing out trees from city blocks, because we want to keep those green spaces.
Yeah, no, and I mean, the good citizen thing, like what you were talking about, and a little bit, I mean, that's interesting. I never really thought about protecting the food web means the planet is more beautiful and, a nicer place to live and stuff like that. It's definitely something about Star Wars that every once in a while really takes me out of the story, is the killing of, big wildlife or whatever. Like if you think about Tatooine now after they've killed that Krayt dragon, that played an important role probably in ecosystem balance. So, maybe the Tuskens don't mind that now the Banthas will, be able to breed more and stuff like that until the next Krayt dragon reaches a big enough size. But it really bummed me out, that episode where they killed this, apex predator that's probably been alive for thousands of years. Or, who knows if that big squid thing in the middle of the Kessel Run had any purpose in supporting that environment, but it lived there. It was just minding its own business.
Or turning those giant ice spiders into the villains when we crashed into their home.
Yeah, exactly. You crashed into their home, ate their babies, and then and then killed a whole bunch of them. So yeah, no, I try not to get too into that, but I did. The first thing I wrote for Nerdist actually was a how dare he sort of piece about the Mandalorian. So yeah, I mean, just the being good citizens and certainly respecting the food web, right? If you take out these big apex predators, you're going to have a less beautiful planet. It's going to affect everything downstream. So
cool. So, we talked about desert planet, frozen world, garden world, things very relatable to us. we're going to move on to a planet now that we don't really have a framework or a concept of what life would be like, and that's Bespin. Bespin is a gas planet. So in our solar system, we have 2 gas planets, right? Okay, yeah, see, I went to school. We have 2 gas planets, but we don't know much about what if life could exist on a gas planet. So in Bespin, it's known for its Tibanna gas mining, which is important for hyperspace travel, and it's got somehow a breathable atmosphere above this layer of Tibanna gas. And there are actual organisms in the expanded universe that we've seen that have adapted and somehow evolved to live in a world where there is no solid ground. So, if we see, if we were able to go to, Saturn, right? What do you think it'd be like Bespin?
Okay, so I have a lot to say, actually, so I'm waiting for it. So this idea about life in these gas giant planets, so Carl Sagan, which is a name you might be familiar with, who's often considered kind of the father of this field of astrobiology, which is looking for, life beyond the Earth, he wrote a paper in maybe like the 60s in which he talks about these basically like bag organisms kind of that are basically gas jellyfish, where they kind of would be flouncing around potentially in the atmosphere, and that was, I think, one of the first proposed ideas for how you might get this like unique form of life. As someone who works on how we detect signs of life, I'm very concerned about looking for signs of life, because in a gas giant atmosphere things look very different than in an atmosphere like we have on the Earth, or we would have on Naboo, or any of these other sort of more rocky planets that we've talked about. So I think my concern with this is like, if you can go there, that's great. If you can't go there, I think it's going to be very confusing to try to pick out what those signs of life are. And I think the idea that you would have some sort of stable, breathable layer would really depend on like what your circulation was like, and that depends on how fast your planet's rotating, if there's a moon, what all the sort of other system interactions are. I actually looked this up yesterday on the Star Wars Wikipedia, but Bespin is about the same size as Yavin, and obviously Yavin is mostly known for the habitable moon Yavin 4, and so I think when I think about these gas giant planets, I'm mostly interested in their moons, quite honestly, and moons that might potentially be more Earth-like. So I think this is possible, but I think it's not something that we're going to see anytime soon until we can do like sort of interstellar travel, which I don't think we're near.
I think another issue, and you can probably confirm this, is especially Jupiter. Jupiter gives off a ton of radiation, and some of its closest Galilean moons are getting blasted by that radiation. Mm-hmm. So having something floating just above the clouds doesn't sound like a very hospitable place.
Yes, absolutely. The magnetic radiation belts around Jupiter are quite severe, and so that would definitely be a problem. So it's again something where you're kind of like the habitable zone. You'd have to thread the needle very carefully to be like, it's far enough away to avoid the radiation, but it's still maybe close enough to get some warmth or reflected light or something. So it's we actually don't have any confirmed exomoons, and it's because they're very, very hard to detect, like smaller objects around a planet, around a star that's like 10 light years away. It's very difficult to do, but I think that's what really interests me about these potential giant planet systems is thinking about their moons.
No, and honestly, before this panel, I didn't ever think about Bespin as being the whole planet is a gas planet. Like Saturn or Jupiter. Aren't Uranus and Neptune also gas?
They're sort of more ice because of how cold they are.
Okay.
It ends up being that their composition is sort of more slushy. Not to go back.
Again, no, let's do it.
Yeah. We're going to make that happen.
Yeah, we should.
Slush ball, all the way.
Yeah, so honestly, I just never even thought about what was below those clouds because I was just busy being like, ooh, pretty. But, they show Lando and meeting them out just on an open platform, so clearly up there, at least, in that particular cloudy area, those people can breathe, although they can breathe on every planet they go to for the most part. So I don't think too much about that, but I just never thought about it, so I think this is great.
So I also think, not to go back on this again, but you have this idea of these layers of gas, and basically what you were just saying, is there a surface underneath? And in the Star Wars universe, they've gone for no. They've said this planet is way bigger. But you could also imagine that if Bespin was about the size of Earth, you maybe would have some kind of surface underneath, and you might have something like Venus, where you have all these heavy layers of clouds, and then you have a surface underneath. Of course, Venus has some other problems in terms of can it host life, and I don't think you would necessarily get a layer of Earth breathable air, but there is some research that people do and kind of thinking about could different areas of the Venus cloud deck potentially be habitable for microorganisms, and that really depends on what you think microorganisms need to survive.
Cool.
Okay, so moving on, for the sake of time, because we have one more planet to cover, and I both love this planet and hate it. And so we're going to move on to the Galactic Center. We're going to Coruscant.
That's just the way.
So Coruscant it's an artificial world in a way, because it's a city that takes over the whole planet. You know, they have an artificial climate because they've got all these machines and inventions to help make sure that it's still livable, because they've removed all of the things that make a planet habitable, so they have to force it. And this is, I think, a unique look into science fiction, because it could be a potential warning for us on our planet as well. What happens if we push a planet beyond what it should be? So what are your thoughts on Coruscant, our panel of experts?
I think going back to what we were talking about with Naboo, I think this is the opposite extreme. They completely got rid of all green spaces, and so as the generations grew up, they stopped caring, and so the city just kept expanding, and there was no emphasis or importance placed on keeping those green spaces. So I think this is kind of like the complete opposite, the opposite extreme.
Yeah, I was always sort of surprised that the Jedi headquarters would be there. You know, especially now with the sequels and TV shows where we see all the other Jedi temples, you know, on Ahch-To and whatever planet Mando took Grogu to. You know, if this is what Jedi temples were sort of meant to be, the one on Coruscant makes even less sense. And I know that that's probably an indictment on what the Jedi had become, blah, blah, blah. But, like, I just remember that being sort of shocking to me in the prequels. Was really, this is where they would choose to be? You know, that's not, sure you're connected to people there, but you're not connected to all things the way that the Force, you know, says it would be. So.
Plus the rent must have been crazy.
They're probably grandfathered in somehow, you know. Yeah. It's something I didn't know about, but we had Kimberly Miner, who was going to be on this panel on an episode of Star Warsologies that comes out soon. And we were talking about, apparently there's somewhere in like a courtyard on Coruscant where there's like this tiny rock, and it's the highest peak of Coruscant. Like, that's how built up everything is that there's this tiny rock, you know, a couple feet tall or whatever, and that is like their tip of Everest. And that's the only natural formation on the planet that you can see. And I think it's in a book, and then it's in a Clone Wars episode, and I haven't seen it, but like, that is definitely...
Is that in the Mortis arc, I think?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think, if my memory fails me, but I think there was a tree possibly in that courtyard. Also, it was Mortis, so it might not be the most accurate depiction. But I was going to say, I think that's the only depiction of any kind of natural element that we've seen on that planet.
I think one thing, too, is, like, if you look at the expanded universe, you know, they treat animals, they basically don't have, like, laws to say, like, you can't bring certain animals and stuff. But when you mess with an environment so much, Melissa, and you just bring in tons of animals from across the galaxy, and a lot of them get loose and whatever, I'm sure that's got to mess with so much of the conservation-wise and ecology. I mean, even pushing beyond just the technology stuff, introducing tons of invasive species to a planet like Coruscant's got to be something bad.
Yeah, definitely. So I go back to there's a Star Wars wildlife book that Terrell Whitlatch illustrated back around the prequel time, and Coruscant is listed on there, and it's literally just pests, basically. It's like, oh yeah, there's a zoo, and hopefully there's some animals from like Alderaan in there, so we still have some of those, but there's a zoo, and then other than that, it's like Dianoga in the sewer system, and you know, rat type things, and that's pretty much it. So who knows what used to live there. But yeah, certainly invasive species are a big deal, and especially with that much coming and going. Like, I don't know if any of you have ever been to a country where they come and like spray your bags and stuff like that before you come in, or you have to like wipe your feet really well if you've been hiking or something like that. But that's a huge thing, and I used to work on research ships, and the water that you had to like ballast out the ship, if you got that in a certain port, you couldn't dump it in another one, because any tiny, you know, little baby mussels or something like that are in that will usually go crazy in a new environment and take over. And so that's a huge part. There's a huge problem in like the Great Lakes. There's zebra mussels, if you've heard of those. Rats and other, I mean, any mammals on the Hawaiian Islands, none of those are native. So rats that kill all the native species. So yeah, I mean, on a galactic scale, that's wild to me. Like Minox, you know, on the outside of the ship that we see, that's just one thing, right? Those feed off of electricity. That's just one thing they show. But yeah, I mean, there's none of that sort of infrastructure. It kind of when war is going on, money gets allocated elsewhere or whatever. But yeah, I would love, I'm a nerd this way, but like I would love to see a show about wildlife enforcement. when they announced that like ranger show that was coming out, I was like, "Oh, is this going to be like park rangers?" No, it's not.
Oh my god, I want to be on that show.
Right?
All right, so we're running low on time, so we're going to move on. Just a couple more questions that we want to talk about, right? So, like, in terms of evolution, we've looked at a few planets, we've looked at different things. How much does our environment actually affect evolution, really quickly?
Oh, I'm just going to take the point on this one.
Do it.
It is vital. Every mass extinction in Earth history is a result of climatic change. The organisms are adapting to very specific environments, and these ecosystems are very delicate. And so when you have something that's living in these very balanced ecosystems, changing it up invasive species or removing megafauna really can affect it and either push evolution or lead to extinctions. Those are sort of the two avenues that the environment is affecting it. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Phil. And what kind of alien environments can we really expect outside of the Sol system? Do you think we can see another Naboo out there?
Okay, I can take this. So one of the things that we've really learned from in maybe like the past 10 years is that there are a lot of there's at least a couple kinds of planets that we don't see any of in our solar system. And so that these are planets that are different sizes, planets like Jupiter that orbit super close to their sun and things like that. So I think we're really just starting to scratch the surface of understanding the diversity of planets that's out there. And technology is still sort of advancing to the point where we could maybe start to look for these potentially habitable planets. In terms of this question, I think we could really expect anything because there is such a broad range. We now think that almost every star has a planet, and if you think about how many stars you can see and how many stars are out there that you can't see, that is a huge, huge range of possible environments that we could potentially see.
Cool.
I'm going to skip ahead because I want to give time for questions. I want to ask one more question for all of our panelists. And looking at evolution, climate change, and conservation, all things we've kind of discussed today, what are some lessons that we can really take away by looking at the Star Wars galaxy from a perspective of science and conservation? Like, if we're looking at it from that, what kind of lessons can we bring to audiences that are out there?
That's a good question. My love of science definitely feeds into my love of Star Wars, right? Like, even in the newest thing in Andor, there's that sequence on Aldhani or whatever with the meteor shower or whatever they call it. And, it's just, there are inspirational moments everywhere, and that's kind of where you find, balance, and I like seeing those moments. And obviously that episode has a tragic ending, but, just everyone sort of taking those moments, and even in, the Imperials who are there still being like, wow, that's really amazing. Those sort of moments are something that I liked seeing in the show. I like the little animals scurrying by, even if they're not part of the plot or anything like that. So just those little moments, and that's kind of what we find, like if you're from LA, where we are now, or Southern California, that's pretty built up, you find those little moments to be inspired by nature.
Yeah, kind of falling off of that, the thing that I've been harping on is just the preservation of our green spaces. I don't want to get to a world like Coruscant where future generations of kids are learning about animals only through pictures that they've seen, or learning about environments only through pictures, because we don't have those environments anymore. So keeping those green spaces in cities, even if it's just a park system in a city, at least it gives those kids, it gives future generations those experiences, that personal connection to the natural world. And hopefully that will make them care about it and continue that preservation.
Michaela?
Yeah, I think on the theme of this panel, right, while we don't have, a force that actually ties us all together and all of that, I think, we do all share this planet, and we do all share responsibilities to fellow humans and to the ecosystems around us. And so I think that is sort of a useful tool for thinking about, like, yes, there is something that binds us all, and it's that we all share this planet and that we all exist in these kind of shared spaces. And so I think that can be a really useful framework for saying, like, no, we are all, like, bound together just by kind of all being on this planet.
Yeah, I think there's also a great use of Star Wars universe because it's a way, you have these really creative people, and they come up with these ideas for planets or solar systems, and then as a scientist, so like Michaela's group in particular, they're able to start looking out into the cosmos and be like, okay, well, can you have a desert planet around two stars, right? Sometimes as scientists we get very stuck in our world, and it's nice to have these sort of external fictional realities that we can then explore and see, like, is this possible in XYZ, yes or no.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. There's been some really great discussions, and let's open up to questions. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? In the back.
Yeah, about hot. The mammals, the humans and other mammals that we have on Earth that live in those environments didn't originate there. So I would think with hot, how can you explain those creatures? There had to be a part of the planet that was more equatorial, or does he maybe they originated at a different time period and then the planet cooled and they somehow survived?
That's a great question. So the question was like how or where did the mammals or mammal-like organisms on Hoth first evolve from? Is it from a different time period? What do you all think?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, like I said, there's the polar bear caribou allegory, but I don't know enough about every single species. If they didn't evolve there, if they evolved, in temperate areas and then sort of, oh, there's this niche up there, nobody's eating that lichen, and then the polar bears are like, sweet, nobody's eating those caribou, then yeah, they've got to have come from somewhere. So yeah, I mean, certainly what you were talking about with the, snowball Earth and stuff like that, if planets are changing, maybe it was an Endor at some point, and then, moved farther from a star or something. I don't know how that works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the way to approach it, right? Is that evolution, it's not like, how things evolve, it's not like you wake up one day and you're like, I'm just going to have wings. It's you have to adapt already existing traits, right? So like for sapiens, if we were to develop wings, we wouldn't just grow extra limbs. Our arms would essentially turn into wings, right? So, if I had to spitball, my bet would be that this is a pre-existing ecosystem and that these organisms have adapted over millions of years to live in this harsh environment.
I think one thing to talk about really quickly is that in science, paleontology, and all that stuff, when we talk about evolution, we don't just talk about this in a vacuum. Our story of how life forms on our planet is based upon the evidence that we find in the fossil record and DNA and things like that. So how we know where we came from, where our origins lie, that's because we have that evidence to help us create those pathways and understand that story. And the cool thing too about science, and I think a lot of times we forget this, is that it's ever changing. Science isn't just these facts that you have. Science is based on all of these different types of new ideas and new discoveries made that change our perceptions and change the story. Science itself is constantly evolving, and as scientists, it's our job to help make sure that we can share that. So we have time for one more question. Anybody? Yes.
If we were comparing the two suns on Tatooine to our sun and how hot it is over there, would the two suns be like half the heat our sun gives off, or would it kind of be like double the heat we have here?
Okay, so this depends on the star type. So if you go on the official Star Wars Wikipedia page,
Wikipedia, by the way,
yeah,
I love that.
If you go to Wikipedia, the definitive source for Star Wars information, and you look at, they do actually, the Star Wars universe is really built out, right? So they do talk about the star types, and they suggest that at least one of the stars that Tatooine is orbiting is a red type star, which is kind of the coolest type of star. So from there you can guess that maybe they would be getting maybe like 1.5 or something like that times the amount of sort of heat that we get. My understanding is that the reason why Tatooine is a global desert, though, has more to do with like a global catastrophe in the past, rather than it just being like receiving a huge amount of light. So it's kind of like a little bit of both. But the specific answer to that requires even more detailed science than what we have established in the universe.
Yeah, because they definitely show night on Tatooine. It's not just that one sun sets and another one rises, so there's always being baked. They definitely show them setting together and there being night. So yeah, I never really thought about that.
It's a very carefully constructed orbit, is what I would say.
Yeah, right.
Randomly, you probably wouldn't get that, but they do show evidence in the Star Wars universe that they were able to move suns at one point. So maybe that's what happened.
Can a second star can't really come into being once the planet's there, right? Like, it's not like it was orbiting one star and now it's orbiting two or something.
Well, it could have been the orbit could have changed. There's two types of orbits for two stars. One where it kind of orbits in between the two stars, and one where it orbits both of them. So it could have had some kind of orbital evolution like that, or if the first star was really massive, it could have attracted a second star. But I don't think that's what's going on, because both of the stars look kind of reddish to me, which implies that they're smaller. But again, this is just...
That's just to have pretty sunsets, though, I think.
I would take so many selfies on Tatooine.
Yes,
okay. So unfortunately, everybody, that does it for our time. Thank you all so much for joining us. I want everyone to know that all of our guest panelists are going to be down at the Cosplay for Science booth for most of the weekend. So if you have more questions, please come visit us. We've got lots of natural history specimens so you can learn more about evolution in a galaxy far, far away. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank
you. Thank you to our families and panelists.
Thank you. That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. I really want to thank Gabe Santos of the ALF Museum and Cosplay for Science for inviting us to take part in this great mashup of everything Star Wars and science. And I want to thank all of you for listening, and for those of you who came out to LA Comic Con as well.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's StarWarsologies @gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook. Just look for the Star Warsologies podcast fan group. Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service. No topic is off limits, even whether Ewoks can actually touch their hands together.
We're part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvels, including the Max FX podcast, Resilient Squadron, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com. We'll see you next time on Star Warsologies, when we talk about climate science in the world of Star Wars. Comic-Con!